Welcome, everybody. This is a good group. My name's Doug Bruggeman. I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, specializing in developing landscape scale tradable credit systems. I'm sponsoring the webinar series, the Conservation on Species Credits, and founded the idea of the webinar series to just bring greater awareness to species crediting issues, to improve the policy, practice, and science of species offsetting. And I want to thank the steering committee, Donna Collier, Craig Denisoff, Greg DeYoung, and Sarah Johnson for their help. We've been doing it for several months now. We've covered a lot of talks at the broader policy scale. And now I'm excited to bring in Rachel Henry, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to give some more of a case study example. I'm really excited about the natural history strategy that they're taking. And so with that, I just want to remind you that we do record these and we post them on YouTube so you can look at them later. And that while Rachel is giving a presentation, to encourage you to type your questions in the chat box to everybody. And then we'll get to those questions at the end. And there'll even be time for you to unmute. And if you want to ask further questions and support a conversation, that'd be great. So with that, I want to introduce Rachel Henry and turn it over to Rachel. Let me know how I can help further.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Oh, wrong button. Sorry. I'm used to being on Teams, so give me 1 second here. Let me share. And we'll get started. Doug, does that look okay?
Looks great.
All right, cool. So I'm Rachel Henry. I am the Habitat Conservation Plan Coordinator in the Ventura Fish and Wildlife Office. And I'm also our species lead for the California tiger salamander, most of which occurs on private land. So that was kind of the impetus and driver behind getting this tool kind of online and working through. So my presentation is regarding a geospatial mitigation tool that we developed for the California tiger salamander and its management implications. So just a quick overview of what I'll be presenting on. I'll quickly go over background information on the species, and then quickly present on how we used to do mitigation, go over some research that provided us with the grounds to improve our methodology, then move into how we are assessing and calculating mitigation now, go through a few project examples, and then move on to just kind of to bring us home. Other things to consider when applying this model. This is kind of my ever, evolving kind of place that I just park my issues I've run into or other ideas, considerations, future, just kind of thoughts to keep in mind when using this tool. So for the biology of the species, this is a very oversimplified capture of salamander, but CTS require a combination of both aquatic and upland habitats. They breed in the aquatic habitats and spend the majority of their lives, the rest of their lives, up in the uplands. And when it comes to management of the species, we consider habitat within 1.3 miles of a pond feature to be suitable breeding habitat. So the way we used to assess mitigation was this kind of fixed mitigation ratio, which really gave no consideration of value of that habitat to the species. It was 2 to 1, 3 to 1, kind of regardless on what the real on the ground status or quality of that habitat was. And it really, like I said, gave no consideration to the habitat value of the species. Another thing that it did is it didn't give any control to the applicants or really incentivize applicants to think about where they were siting their projects. If you're going to get hit with a 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 mitigation ratio, you know, let's just do it in the area that works best for us, which a lot of times, especially with this species that occurs in the lowlands and the flat areas, tends to kind of be the place that's best for development. So without really incentive to look elsewhere, we tend to kind of we were finding that impacts were being cited in the areas that had the best quality habitat for the species. So in 2008, Chris Searcy and Dr. Brad Schaefer put together this paper called Calculating Biologically Accurate Mitigation Credits, Insights from the California Tiger Salamander. And in this paper, they present long-term data, a long-term data set that provides habitat value based on dispersal of individuals and the reproductive value of those individuals. And basically what this data showed is that habitat closer to the pond is more valuable to the species than that which is farther away. And what that suggests is applying a sliding scale for mitigation ratios where habitat closer to pond should be mitigated for at a higher ratio than habitat that's farther away. And that's what you're seeing in this graph here. The x-axis is distance in meters from a pond. And on the y-axis is mitigation ratio. So you see it goes all the way up from, it starts at 5.8 right next to, you know, the water's edge essentially, all the way out to 2,500 meters or about 1.3 miles where you get down to 0. So that was the first part of the research. The second part of the research that they presented is this idea that they refer to of a deficit wedge. And this deficit wedge refers to habitat that's rendered inaccessible or more difficult to access for a salamander to access as they're dispersing across the landscape. You can kind of think of this as lingering effects to the species that continue to impact the population after implementation of a project. So it's kind of those future ongoing effects. And I have this cartoon that I'm going to present next. It's a little elementary, but I feel like it drives home the idea behind this deficit wedge quite well. So here we have our perfect, pristine CTS landscape with our small mammal burrows, and right in the center of it is our breeding pond. Some sort of development is proposed on the habitat, which of course you can see has a direct impact within the footprint. So that's kind of that part one of the research that they present. So there's our first impact being in the footprint under that yellow building. And then we have our rains. CTS emerge from the uplands and disperse towards the breeding pond where magic happens and a bunch of baby CTS kind of, you know, are just come out of the pond after they've metamorphosed and are coming back up into the upland habitats where they will spend the majority of the rest of their lives. Now we have the development there, which has this shadow effect or that deficit wedge on the backside of it. And you can see where that red squiggly line is. That habitat is now much harder or inaccessible to those salamanders that are dispersing from that pond. Now, it's not to say that the habitat on the other side of that impact has no reproductive value or has zero habitat quality. It's more of a delta. And you can kind of think of it where the habitat directly behind the impact is harder for a salamander to access than farther out. So you can kind of think of it's far less likely for a CTS to travel on the trajectory of that green arrow than the blue. The model does, well, I'll get into that later, but yeah, so you can kind of think of a delta where the loss in reproductive value directly behind the impact has a larger loss in reproductive value than that which is farther away, all the way out to 1.3 miles. So we turn this into a geospatial tool that we run in ArcMap, and basically this tool can do 3 things. It can calculate the reproductive value of a particular area, and we've also included the ability to input pre-existing land use, which I think was a really awesome way to be able to really capture what's going on the landscape. Unfortunately, it's not a pristine, you know, there's no more pristine habitats out there, generally speaking. So taking into consideration the actual state of habitats is important when coming up with accurate mitigation calculations. The other number two, it can also calculate the loss in the reproductive value resulting from a particular impact. And it can also calculate the reproductive value of a proposed conservation area. So to move into just some conceptual examples to kind of drive home what I'm talking about, here's a project. I think it's about a 1 square mile proposed project, and you can see that it's right in between, you know, a handful of CTS breeding ponds. We know that area, the connected upland habitat between breeding ponds is of higher value than that on the periphery, where it might only have impact or not impact, but habitat input from one pond. But those connective habitats really have a big impact because you're blocking CTS dispersing from more than one pond. So you can see there within the black polygon, that is the loss in reproductive value that is occurring within the footprint. And then you can see each of those wedges is associated with a pond within 1.3 miles of that impact area. So you're not only accounting for the loss happening within that footprint, it's the deficit wedge from each pond within 1.3 miles. This is an actual output from the tool. Like I said, it runs an ArcMap, kind of the visual output that it gives you. And then the model also provides you with this Excel sheet. Lots of numbers here, but if you kind of look at the area I have encircled in red, it totals up the loss resulting within the footprint and also within the shade. And you'll notice within the footprint is about a loss of 16,000. Within the shadow, I call the shadow, it's synonymous with deficit wedge, is about 28,000. So we typically find that the impacts occurring in the deficit wedge far outnumber what's occurring within the footprint. And, you know, I think going back one slide, you can kind of see this here. It's the impacts go far beyond what's happening within the footprint of the impact, but really has those effects, you know, beyond the exact scope of the project. So these two totaled up are what we look for applicants to be offsetting. So it would be a total reproductive loss and reproductive value of about 45,000. Now let's take that.
Is that 45,000 in acres? What sort of?
It's a reproductive value, and it is a unitless measurement. Like I said, it is it's a probability. Each square, well, you can get down to different measurements, but it's basically goes back to the likelihood or probability of a specific CTS, and they broke them in the paper. They broke them out into 3 age classes. So you can kind of think of, we'll go young, medium, and old. Young and medium have a higher reproductive value than those that are old because they still have time to reproduce. And so this is all going back to long line data that they did, where they went out and did a series of upland drift fence surveys and found different age classes at varying distances from the pond. And again, it's kind of this weird thing, but it's a unitless, it all came out to a unitless reproductive value. So it's not acres, it's kind of this, it's a probability. The paper provides a lot more information on that. It's kind of a complex thing. So going back to this conceptual project example, if we take that exact project and move it 1 mile to the west, you can see visually how much the impacts decrease. That's not only good for the species, it's also good for the applicant. You know, can really incentivize folks, like I said, to look at where they're siting their projects. We don't, you know, we want to preserve that high quality habitat and incentivize folks to go into those lower quality habitats. Here's the output table, and you can see what was at about a reproductive value of about 45,000 drops down to just under 2,000. So you can think of, you know, the necessary mitigation required to offset that goes down drastically. Again, really incentivizing folks to look at the area in which they're proposing impacts in. I have a few real project examples. I think Second one will be of interest because we start getting into banking and how this can correlate to purchasing credits at the bank. But here's a farming project in the Santa Maria area, showing our loss in reproductive value within the footprint. And here we have our deficit wedge. One cool thing to see here, as I spoke of earlier, is how the tool has the ability to take into account pre-existing land use. You can see those black hatched areas were actually areas where we're able to input polygons and put in specific parameters about not just the habitat value or lack thereof kind of within the footprint of those impacts, but also how permeable those land uses are. If you know, these are row crops, so there is some level of permeability, albeit not that much, but it's very different than, you know, you can think of a brick wall or a Walmart where, you know, there's nothing permeating that type of structure. So again, we totaled up the loss in reproductive value resulting within the footprint and within the deficit wedge, come out to about 156,000. This particular project was proposing on-site mitigation. This is just the area just to the southwest of that farming project, and they actually had 3 known breeding ponds on site that they were willing to put into a conservation easement and manage long-term and in perpetuity for the good of the species. So like I said in the beginning, this tool also has the ability to calculate the reproductive value within that easement, to ensure that we are getting adequate mitigation for the impacts. So you can see here, it says we require a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio of reproductive value. Again, that's the footprint plus the deficit wedge. So it's kind of a confusing thing, you know, when you're talking reproductive value, it's much different than like a 1-to-1 acre to acre. This proposed mitigation area was about 500 acres, and the impact area was about 180. This had a pretty high reproductive value given that 3 known breeding ponds were present on site. This next example is for a housing development, also kind of in the Santa Maria area. I like this example because it really, I think this project was cited really, really well. The footprint of this housing development was, I want to say, about 150 acres. And it only results in a loss of reproductive value within the footprint of about 11,000. And that's because it's, you know, sited right next to pre-existing land use. You know, we want to incentivize folks to kind of concentrate impacts and stay out of those nice, intact, large swaths of habitat that are really important and meaningful for the species and for the recovery of the species. So you see the footprint there and the deficit wedge. The deficit wedge is pretty darn small, again, because you get into that pre-existing land use, which is taken into account in the modeling. This project proponent decided to purchase credits from a conservation bank. And here is our conservation bank for the Santa Barbara, California tiger salamander. The layout's a little weird, but it had to do with severed mineral rights and issues with getting the entire parcel into an approved bank status, or being approved by both agencies. But how will we kind of create the crosswalk between reproductive value and credits is by running the model on the entire layout of the bank. The total bank has a reproductive value of about 600,000. There are 715 credits available at the bank. So we just divide that up and give an average reproductive value per credit. So this, that project came out to needing about 22 credits purchased from the bank. That's kind of an example of, you know, where there's far less, you get far less mitigation acres to acres. We also see the opposite. I mean, when folks are proposing impacts really close to breeding habitats or in that connective habitat, we will see again, going back to acres to acres, which I try not to do, we would see sometimes mitigation ratios, again, acres to acres being 10 to 1. We've even gone up to 12 to 1. Again, just because the habitat that they're impacting is so valuable to the species. I can quickly go over this project. I actually included this because I gave this presentation to our Sacramento office when we were looking to use this modeling up in the central DPS. And so this is another housing development near the city of Hollister. There you can see the footprint and the deficit wedge. Again, kind of a well-sited project occurring immediately adjacent to pre-existing land use. Here's the Sparling Bank. Again, we did the same thing where we ran the model for the entire bank, divided the total reproductive value by the number of credits. And this one, each credit has a reproductive value of about 1,000. And then we just kind of divide it up, and that's how we do the math to decide, or to really let folks know, how many credits they'll need to purchase to offset impacts resulting from their project. So other considerations, this is kind of my running list of things to keep in mind. Recovery criteria, we had one project where the reproductive value numbers came out beautifully, but the project as proposed would actually preclude recovery criteria in one of our metapopulation areas. Needless to say, it was not an appropriate time to be using that model. Keeping recovery criteria in mind and ensuring that we are not precluding recovery and able to meet Section 7 standards are, of course, extremely important. Habitat availability, this came about when there were some ponds known to really be kind of the backbone of maybe certain metapopulations that had been undergoing years of habitat loss and fragmentation. But again, because they were the backbone to some of these species, to some of these local populations, the remaining habitat that was available for the species around these ponds was actually weighted more heavily than the tool was spitting out, again, because of just the ongoing habitat loss that had been occurring and the ongoing impacts that had been occurring. It was just needed to make sure that any more impacts occurring to that population were mitigated at a higher rate because of those ongoing incremental impacts. Microhabitats have almost deleted this from the list, although I think it's an important thing to kind of think about. I've had folks say, okay, well, you've removed pre-existing land use, let's say a house or a shed, something that's pretty small, but could be an impediment to dispersal. Well, what about, removing trees or rocks? Where do you draw the line on what is an impediment to dispersal? It's a really hard question to answer. I think when it comes to the trees and rocks type thing, we're not going through and picking those out or including them in the pre-existing land use shapefiles on the conservation side of things. So if you have these small impediments to dispersal on your impact analysis where you're trying to kind of cut down how much mitigation, we're also not removing those from the conservation side of things. So I really think it's a wash in the end. You're always going to have these impediments to dispersal on those really small levels. But if you're not including them on either side, it's just kind of a wash in the end. Temporary versus permanent, or as I like to say, I think more accurately, permeable versus impermeable. The way we have accounted for those in the past is how we include or maybe not include the deficit wedge. If you have an impact that's occurring over one dry season, say an anomaly dig on a pipeline, and after they're done with the dig, the area is going to be restored, it will be permeable to the species. I don't think it's appropriate to include or have the applicant mitigate for the loss of reproductive value resulting from the deficit wedge, because there isn't any. There will be nothing there in the long term that will be impeding or impacting the species' ability to disperse across the landscape. Sometimes we've had impediments that might be in place for like a year or two, We've gone through a table on how to assess and discount that. We can get into that more if folks have questions, but we do analyze anything having lingering impacts for more than 5 years as a impermeable or permanent impact. Anything less than that, again, we have this way of weighting how much mitigation should be assigned for that. Critical habitat, it's kind of has to do again with habitat availability or kind of what I was talking to with habitat availability. I also think it kind of overlaps a little bit with recovery criteria. Some areas just might need to be weighted a little heavier than others. State agency requirements, just something to keep in mind when you're working through permitting, the permitting process for these projects, ensuring that you're kind of, I do a lot of work with CDFW in trying to help applicants get consistency determinations. So making sure that whatever's in our HCP or in our incidental take statement, or really in our incidental take permit or incidental take statement, meets state agency requirements, so folks can go after consistency determination. That might not always be necessary, but just something to keep in mind. And I'm sure there are other considerations here that I haven't listed. And my last slide, just kind of bringing it all home. Like I've said a few times, I really think this methodology incentivizes applicants to look to areas that are less impactful on the species. It also provides the agencies with a tool to work with applicants. Habitat quality, like kind of bleeds into number 2, but it does tend to drive projects towards lower quality habitat. And also incentivizes applicants, if they're thinking of permitting responsible mitigation, for looking for those high quality habitats, which again kind of bleeds into number 3. You using this tool provides us with increased confidence that the mitigation is of a higher value to the species. I mean, I think that the visual impact, or the visual resources that this tool provides, and you can kind of see it right then and there. How many ponds or how many individual CTS is this piece of property either hurting or helping by conserving? Also, and lastly, mitigation options. Applicants can seek out, again, those mitigation options with the higher habitat quality. They can get some more, bang for their buck by preserving ponds, which have a really high reproductive value in the model. And now I got time for questions. I saw a few come up, but wasn't able to read them while I was speaking. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. That was a great example of, capturing those difficult landscape scale indirect effects. And so we do have one question here in the chat. I do want to jump in and take the host benefit and ask a quick question of, as a regulatory agency, how do you catch these landscape scale indirect effects for enforcement?
Oh, I mean, enforcement is, I think one of our biggest Achilles. It's a tough thing to enforce. I mean, unless you can, in a lot of cases, prove take. I'm sure we've all heard of meeting that dead body, which with a species like this is practically impossible. It can be really hard to get enforcement, to get management to take these things seriously. I don't know if I have a great question to that, or answer to that question. And if anybody else does, I'd love to hear it. It's a tough thing.
Sure. Yeah, it's all challenging. All right, let me jump into the first question in the chat here from Matt Brown regarding reproductive value. Is this tool/methodology being proposed to go both ways, impact and mitigation assessment? In other words, if we're impacting marginal or lower value habitat, but mitigate with higher value habitat, could we have a lower ratio compared to the conventional 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1? For example, if 10 acres of low value habitat is impacted, but proposed mitigation would be high value habitat, theoretically, it seems logical that each acre credit should be worth double or triple towards the project impact.
Yeah, we see that a lot. And to be quite honest with you, I think when I first started utilizing this tool, it made me a little uncomfortable. You know, I kind of felt like we maybe weren't getting the amount of habitat that we should be for impacts, but I've gotten over that. I actually think that using this tool provides us with the means to get biologically accurate mitigation credits. If somebody is impacting 10 acres of marginal habitat and proposing to preserve a pond, let's say a 1 acre pond, you know, a lot of times that reproductive value will pan out. And I think that was one of my take home messages, that applicants can get bang for their buck. They can look for those high quality habitats and preserve them, and they'll see a cost savings. So yeah, we do see that. I think that still makes some other folks a little uncomfortable with the tool until they see something where the opposite happens, right? Maybe an applicant is impacting 2 acres of really high quality habitat and the reproductive value is sky high, and it's going to require, you know, 20 credits from the bank to offset that. That's when you kind of see it pan out. Like, okay, you know, because it's biologically meaningful, these smaller impacts are they're bigger hits to the species. They should be mitigated for higher. So yeah, it does happen, and that pans out all the time. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a biologically accurate thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I've done similar work. So there's also a question here from Ted Weber that I didn't get to see. I think Ted sent you a question separately. Rachel, did you catch Ted's question?
Oh, chat, okay.
I know it's a lot to keep track of.
Ted, yeah, do you weigh the accessible upland area according to its suitability and the size of the population using the vernal pool? So, do you weigh the accessible upland area according to the suitability? So I think I get what you're asking. The size of the pond does matter. Actually, how it's calculated is it's the distance of the edge of the pond. So it's actually not the pond itself, but it's kind of the water's edge. Is how the tool, the reproductive value and is weighted for each pond. So the pool size is kind of inherently accounted for in there. I don't know if I'm totally answering your question. And the size of the population. So yeah, I mean, bigger pools would support larger populations and have that larger reproductive value. So yes, answer yes. If I didn't answer that clearly,
that's
or
what I was trying to get at was population viability.
Sorry, say that one more time.
I was trying to get at population viability and not just area. So in other words, if the pool supported a large population of tiger salamanders versus one that only supported a few, wouldn't that larger pond in the surrounding area be of more value?
Yeah, and you would see a higher reproductive value come from that pond. And also similarly, areas with multiple ponds, they do play into each other and provide a higher reproductive value because of the other ponds in the vicinity. Again, kind of giving a larger population that's being supported, or a larger population that's being impacted, and therefore a larger mitigation requirement to offset those impacts.
Okay, great. So moving on, we've got a question from Eric Smith, asking if Rachel can share the tool documentation and input data, particularly with regard to land use and ponds. Where can they find that? I can include that information at the bottom of the YouTube video when I post it, or you can maybe share it in other ways too.
Yeah, we're currently, I'm happy to share it. I've shared it with other folks. We actually have kind of a how-to that it goes along with the tool. There's a few quirky things just to keep in mind in it, but I think the how-to kind of documents each of those quirky things well. And I'm also happy to do my best to help people troubleshoot stuff. We're also working to get this tool on some type of platform, maybe hosted, online or through, I know that ArcGIS has like an online portal that we'd love to have that on. That's out of my wheelhouse, or I'd like to say it'd be done already. But I'm happy to share this. It's most easily shared via email. We can talk about other ways to share that, but yeah, happy to share it.
So I'll catch that with Rachel later and share it within the email list as well. So Eric Smith also wants to know, how do you weigh the value of potential habitat that lacks survey data?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. We assume occupation until proven otherwise. We have a pretty rigorous survey protocol for the species. I often think that it is, and a lot of times makes it impossible for applicants or landowners to come to a negative finding. That's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles with species occurring on private lands and access issues, and just really needing to ensure that we're assessing impacts in a conservative manner for the species. It's just the way it is. I wish there was a better way, but most folks, and to kind of go on that a little bit more, the survey protocol requires multiple years of not only aquatic surveys, but also upland driftman surveys, which can be extremely costly. Sometimes they can even cost more than mitigation. So what I typically find is that folks assume presence in ponds in which we don't have survey data and mitigate accordingly.
Right. And then a follow-up question from Eric: how did you choose the 1-to-1 mitigation ratio for reproductive value?
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer to that. When we were coming around to getting this on the ground and implementing it, I did circle back with Brad and Chris and ask them, what do you think about this 1-to-1? And when we looked at, kind of that crosswalk back to acres, looking at projects that impacted high quality habitat versus low quality, they seem to pan out to feel like good numbers. I know that's not a great, feeling isn't a great basis, but when I was looking at, our section 10 regs and meeting the maximum extent practical, it's kind of a gut check anyway. So we just went through a lot of conceptual examples, and the 1-to-1 just seemed to feel like a fair value, not only for the species, but also project proponents. If you started going up, to a 2-to-1 reproductive value, I think that it would make most projects economically infeasible. And so it's a balancing game, making sure that we're getting adequate mitigation, but not hitting folks so hard with mitigation costs that just cause projects to crumble. They should be commensurate with the level of the impacts. Of course, if a project has those high, really skyrocket impacts to a species, then yes, your mitigation is going to be really high. But again, just looking at those conceptual examples and what seemed to make sense and seemed to be fair and seemed to be biologically accurate is how we kind of landed on that 1-to-1.
Yeah, I would further say that given that you have an empirical model that you're applying to a take site and applying the same empirical model to the benefit site, a 1-to-1 ratio would make sense. I just think oftentimes we lack an empirical model to do that.
Right. And
you guys have that, which is great.
You also keep in mind that there's no deficit wedge for the conservation area. The value that you're calculating is only within the footprint of the bank or of the permittee. So it's also kind of the impacts are more heavily mitigated for just through that direct and indirect. So I think it pans out well.
Great. Guys, I'm loving all these questions. Let's keep them coming. And I tell you, if we can't get to the questions now, we'll email you responses later and share it with everybody.
Yeah.
So another question from Ted. Do you weigh the accessible upland area according to its habitat suitability and the size of the population using the vernal pool? How does this approach compare to using a PVA model?
So I think the first part of that was the original question, right? Do you weigh the accessibility upland area according to its suitability and the size of the population using the vernal pool?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You already answered that question.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry.
Cool.
All right, so Tara Collinson has a question. In your project examples for the La Purisma Bank, sorry, how many acres in size was that bank and yielded 175 CTS credits? And for the other Sparling Bank, how many acres in size is that site and how many CTS credits does it have?
So I see that just below that she corrected herself. So yeah, La Purisma Bank has 715 available credits. The size of that bank is 820 acres-ish. Some areas were pulled out based on habitat suitability. And the Sparling Bank. I saw Jeff on here. Jeff, do you have answers to that? You know, off the top of your head?
Sparling Bank is 2,000 acres. Most, but not all of those, I think, are CTS as well.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, then Matt.
So the question, what I was trying to get an idea of with that question is just an idea of, I know that you're trying to get away from this acres to acres impacts, but as a mitigation bank provider, you know, when we buy sites, we pay for acreage.
Right.
So what I'm looking to kind of get an idea of, you know, what is the likelihood if we buy a 1,000-acre, you know, property for a conservation bank, are we going to get, you know, 2 CTS credits? And I know a lot of this depends on habitat suitability, but that's what I was trying to get an idea of. So when you say that 2,000 acres, Sparling Bank was 2,000 acres, how many CTS credits did that translate into? 2,000, or was it like 100?
So
That bank is California red-legged frog and California tiger salamander. So all 2,000 acres are California red-legged frog credits, and then there's just a few places on that bank where the maximum dispersal distance from breeding ponds for CTS don't reach the bank boundary. So there's a few acres excluded for CTS, but the vast majority, well over 90% of the total acreage is credited.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can piggyback on that real quick, Rachel. So kind of along the lines of what Tara was saying, and kind of related to my earlier question, if a property was purchased, say that was 100 acres, but it was loaded with CTS ponds, or either constructed or natural, and it created a higher value or provided a higher value, could you see a situation where credits released would exceed the actual acreage of the property?
My brain is running. I mean, I think so. I think other things might start to come into play. Just kind of carrying capacity of the landscape, what we know about the biology of the species. You wouldn't want to have a 100-acre area and put 200 ponds on it. At some point you kind of start to get out of whack there. But we do see, as ponds move from potential to breeding, they have documented breeding on them, the value of the bank or the per credit the per reproductive value of a credit goes higher and higher, allowing a bank to sell more of them. So yes, you know, in theory, yes.
The reason I ask is just because in some cases, you know, landowners want more than what the market value of their property is. And if there's some kind of multiplier like that, I think that it again creates, you know, incentive for landowners to provide conservation on their property, and it allows, you know, us as mitigation practitioners to maybe agree to prices on property that we wouldn't normally agree to if there's some incentive or some potential for us to get value beyond what the actual acres are. And obviously that would be something, you know, as far as the pond construction and everything, that would be figured out during the IRT phase before the property was bought, theoretically, while it was under an option agreement or something. But again, I think it's really important that this tool isn't used just for on the impact side, that it's used, you know, on the mitigation side also, if it's going to be rolled out in a you know, meaningful enterprise-wide way throughout the state. And I think that that's, you know, one of those caveats that I would love to see considered with this tool.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, we've been implementing this tool as the way we calculate mitigation since 2017. And we always, you can't just calculate the loss in reproductive value resulting on the impact side. You have to be able to correlate that back to the conservation that's occurring. So it's always done on both sides of the coin. And I mean, I also think one of the great incentives of using that on the conservation side of thing is for bankers or landowners to, you know, increasing the habitat value on site is an incentive for them too, which I do think is a great thing. I think I just said that in theory because, again, kind of, you want to make sure that you're not, you know, overloading you're not getting too much breeding habitat for what the upland can support, or vice versa. Of course, it's, you know, multiple things would come into consideration, but I definitely think that incentivizing bankers to increase habitat quality and provide more suitable breeding habitat and doing good things for the species should absolutely be, you know, should pay off on the other side of that by having more credits to sell.
Okay, great. So while Matt's on the horn here, he's got a couple other questions. You know, he liked the idea of impermeable versus permeable rather than permanent versus temporary, and sees that as an interesting take toward long-term effects. I don't know if you want to provide more context there, Rachel, or.
It was just a comment.
Okay. All right. Oh, so also in the spirit of evolving science and understanding of the species, in line with this new tool being developed, is the 1.3 mile dispersal distance being reevaluated given climate change trends and drought conditions?
So in Santa Barbara County, and I'm species lead for the Santa Barbara DPS, the folks down at UCLA, Brad Schaefer and some of his students actually just finished up doing a study on the dispersal distance of the Santa Barbara CTS. For a long time, we were using 1.3 miles because that had come from the northern populations. And they wrapped that up in 2019 and found that it was 1.3 miles was an appropriate distance to be using. So we haven't reevaluated given that it's pretty recent findings down here. As far as the northern clads, I can't speak to that. I think it should definitely be something that we keep in the back of our minds as climate change and drought continues. You know, maybe looking at a smaller radius, but of course, I mean, that's probably something I should add to my second to last slide of other considerations. You know, climate change and drought is a real thing. So.
Okay, great. And so Tara Collins has a question with regard to banks with existing CTS credits assessed the old way. How will they be able to provide mitigation for impacts calculated in the new way? How are you transitioning between the old way and the new way for the species?
Just by taking that reproductive value, finding that average reproductive value per credit, and, you know, creating that bridge between acres and credits. There wasn't really any magic to it. We just ran it in the tool and started implementing it. And, you know, so far so good. We're working on our first one with the Sparling Bank, having that crosswalk between credits and reproductive value. And again, it seems to be panning out just fine. But yeah, I don't know if I have any aha answer to that question. We just ran it in the model and found the total reproductive value and divided it by the number of available credits.
Great. So,
Sorry, this is Tara Collins. So just to clarify, I guess my question, because we've come across this with VELV credits at some of our banks where there was like a change in how impacts and credits were evaluated. So you're saying it's basically you reopen up the credit evaluation agreement in the bank enabling instrument, and it would essentially have to change the number of credits available at the bank using this new geospatial tool.
So we didn't open up the BEI for anything. You know, the number of credits still comes out to a number. Your reproductive value of whatever comes out to needing the purchase of 5 credits purchased. The applicant would purchase those 5 credits, and those 5 would no longer be available, you know, or those would be used under the BEI. So we didn't open anything up. It was just a way of kind of assessing how many credits are needed. It's still whole numbers of credits being sold and being tracked.
Okay, I guess, you know, what I'm thinking of is as a bank sponsor, that reassessing things that way actually, you know, when we develop banks, we have kind of an assessment of how many, you know, credits will be available and how fast they will, you know, be sold and needed and utilized. And I guess this change in protocol could completely throw all of our fiscal planning and projections totally out of whack, and could result in potentially the bank not being profitable. And I'm not saying like, you know, profit is the most important thing, but if our projects aren't financially sound, then we aren't able to do anymore. So that's just a concern that I have, and just wondering if that has been a consideration or a concern with any other bankers.
Yeah, I haven't seen, I mean, you can get some projects where folks are mitigating at a lower mitigation ratio than kind of the old way, air quotes, the old way. But just as often, the opposite happens, where folks are actually mitigating at a higher a higher ratio than the old way. It also, I think, really has made some of our analysis on, you know, we've had a lot of projects come in and want to take a vineyard and turn it into, you know, row crops or cannabis or something like that. And it's really given us the tool to say, okay, even though this might have no habitat value within the footprint of this project, we do know that there is some reproductive value in this habitat because of the dispersal ability across it. So even though, you know, we're not seeing a loss in reproductive value happen within the footprint, there is that loss happening from the deficit wedge. So these folks actually should come in and mitigate for those impacts. So we're also seeing, you know, I just think a more accurate mitigation happening on all fronts. I don't think we probably would have sought mitigation for those kind of changing crops in the past, but now utilizing this tool, we have, and we do get it. So I understand what you're saying. I think when it really comes out, like in reality, I haven't seen that it's caused any banks to be, you know, unprofitable. It's just a kind of another tool in the toolbox for assessing mitigation requirements.
okay, great. So let's move on to Mike Henry's question. Are Sacramento and Bay Delta evaluating the use of this tool, or is this expected to be the Ventura office only for the time being?
So I don't know how to answer this. I have not found the Sacramento office to being very excited about using this. And I'm just saying that because of kind of a lack of interest I've seen. I do think it should be. I think, you know, the two authors of the paper are incredibly, they're incredible researchers, and I think that the science that is presented there is you know, best of science available, and we should be implementing it. I also would like to see this type of model being applied to, you know, other species. There's a lot of other species that we could use to kind of get these biologically accurate mitigation evaluations. But yeah, so far I just haven't seen that bleed into the Sacramento Fish and Wildlife office yet. In the Ventura office, we, like I said, have started using it for the central DPS. Down here, as far as CDFW goes, we're in region 5, up in, you know, that Hollister project area that I showed, that was region 4. So it seems to kind of be baby steps growing and spreading, but for right now, I have shared it with the Sacramento field office and haven't gotten a whole lot of momentum there yet.
Okay, one last question here from Tara Collins. It looks like the geospatial tool takes into account slope when calculating habitat value. Can you speak more on that? Does the tool also take into account things like ephemeral drainages or other types of natural CTS movement deterrents?
So it does not take slope into consideration. I get this question a lot, and I have found on other projects where applicants have come and said, oh, there's no way CTS are on my site. There's a mini Grand Canyon to the north of it. There's no way. And I said, well, let's just put up a drift fence and see what happens. And I've literally had instances where a week later, oh, CTS are in the drift fence. I guess they are on my site. The La Purísima Bank has quite a number of big swales and erosion, and CTS tend to be moving around that area just fine. So I haven't gotten a whole lot of information or data to say that I should or shouldn't take this slope or that slope or this swale or this ephemeral drainage into consideration. So we just kind of treat everything as suitable. And again, we do that on the impact side and the conservation side. So it's kind of going back to those like micro habitats that I was talking about on the second to last slide. I kind of think it's a wash in the end. Again, you know, what's the saying? All models are bad, but some are useful. This is, you know, exactly the same.
Okay, great. Well, Rachel, that was a fantastic presentation. I'm so grateful that you contributed to this, and it led to just incredible discussion, obviously. And I think this is the edge for species crediting, and I hope that this will incite others to contribute other presentations in the same vein, and then keep moving this topic forward. I just want to thank you so much. And if you have any closing thoughts, Rachel, before we go.
No, thanks for the thoughtful questions. I'm, you know, here around, available for any follow-up conversations. Also happy to share the tool and talk more, and thanks for listening, and look forward to speaking with you all soon.
Okay, take care. We'll see you in January. We're taking the holidays off, but we're going to be back in January, some heavy hitters.
All right.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.